Thank you all for joining this afternoon. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on anticipatory action here as part of the COP30 Evidence for Climate Action panel. I'm Jonas Herman. I'm the head of impact evaluation at the World Food Programme based in Rome, and I'm joined by my colleague Jesse Mason, who's the global head of anticipatory action for the World Food Programme. And so today we're going to give you a brief overview of the work we've been doing, trying to rigorously evaluate the impact of anticipatory action in Bangladesh and Nepal over the last few years. And then after we present the findings from Bangladesh and Nepal, I'll hand it over to Jesse to kind of discuss why evidence matters and how evidence is being used by WFP. And then we'll open up for a short Q&A session for anybody who's interested in asking questions about the studies or about how evidence gets used in WFP. So I'm going to try to load my slides now. Let's see who's in chat. Okay. And then let's see if this works. Jesse, can you see the slide now? Cool. All right, so let me go ahead and give you a brief overview. So for those who are not familiar with the impact evaluation work here at WFP, we organize ourselves around what we call thematic windows. And so for WFP, the impact evaluation strategy is very much about learning. It's about trying to understand which interventions are most effective and most cost effective. And so to focus our work, we've been engaging over the years with our program colleagues and our donors and our board to understand which areas in terms of WFP programming is WFP planning to spend its money and to do more in the future. And then we pair those strategies and policies with literature reviews, and we look at, for that area, is there enough evidence and is there enough rigorous evidence to make the case to continue programming in that way? And where there's an evidence gap and there's a need, then we recommend that that's where we focus our impact evaluations. I should also mention that for WFP, impact evaluations are largely what we call experimental, meaning they use a randomized design. We've evolved from kind of traditional impact evaluations where you'd have a randomized design, including a control group. And most of our impact evaluations are more what we call A/B testing. So we're comparing some form of intervention that WFP is doing with the intervention that they are either planning to do, a new type of intervention, or some additional layer of interaction, and seeing if that additional intervention is actually having an impact greater than what would be otherwise achieved. So we have three impact evaluation windows. The first one we set up is on cash and gender, the second on climate and resilience, and then the third is on school meals. And then across those, we have what we call the humanitarian work stream. And so the humanitarian work stream is actually on the same themes, but it's looking more about how does the emergency response or the emergency response of context and needs, how does that shape the efficacy of what WFP is doing? And so for anticipatory action, this is part of our climate and resilience window and very much supported by the humanitarian work stream. Just to note that the impact evaluation team itself is a hybrid team. It included people from my unit here in Rome. It also included people from the World Bank and from the University of Chicago. And most of our work is done in this hybrid way where we have in-house and external academics who are selected based on their expertise, both in terms of thematic and geographic expertise. So for WFP, this question around anticipatory action is actually really important. And it's, I mean, for Jesse, who's been doing this for a while, it's probably not seen as something new, but for the world, anticipatory action is still a relatively new idea, and to use forecasts to actually predict where people are going to be affected by a climate disaster and then to try to support them in advance of that. And so the question we are focusing on for all this work is, what is the impact of delivering cash at the moment of the climate-related extreme disaster? And there's some trade-offs here. So we think that, for example, providing cash earlier could help people avoid the shock or help them prepare better for the shock. But then that means we have to get the cash to them early enough and also to the households that are being most affected. We also think that it might help facilitate early recovery, and so they could actually rebuild quicker if they were affected by the disaster. But then the other thing is, because the disaster has not struck yet, we are not sure before the disaster whether those households that we're supporting will be the most affected. And so there could also be some loss of efficacy in terms of either targeting wrong or supporting people who are not affected by the event. I should just note that across our work, we are still only supporting the poorest populations. And so supporting people who are also not affected by a climate event is probably still good if they already needed support and they're already very poor and vulnerable households. So it's not a huge loss, but it's better if we also affect or are effective in our targeting. The other thing is that for us, it's very important in all of our work to try to think about replicating the impact evaluations in multiple countries, because some things could be very context specific. And so in this case, we've been working across Asia and most of Africa to try to identify opportunities to test anticipatory action. The first two opportunities we got were in Nepal and Bangladesh. And then again, it follows the same question about, is delivering cash as early as possible helping them cope with these shocks? The other thing to note is that in both these countries, the shock itself, it was a flood. And so there were similar floods, different countries, different years, but they allowed us for actually doing quite comparable impact evaluations. And then I'll talk about how that benefits us in terms of the analysis. So in Nepal, we had 12,500 households that were supported by anticipatory action. It was a one-time distribution of US $111. This is a physical delivery of cash, so they were actually given the cash in an envelope. And it was localized triggers based on physical measurements in the river basins. In Bangladesh, it was a much larger intervention. It came about 2 years later. It was for 90,000 households, but the amount given was much smaller, so it's US dollars 43. And that's going to affect some of the results that you're going to see here in a minute. And again, another thing to know is Bangladesh, it was delivered by a mobile money, which is important in terms of the speed of delivery. Here you can see that the designs, again, talking about this is from an A/B testing perspective. And so in Nepal, there we're actually comparing two timings of transfers. The first was given between 2 days and 2 weeks right after the trigger. And so that's as early as possible in that context. And then the second transfer that we compared it to was about 6 weeks after the trigger. And so in each group, we had 70 villages. In Bangladesh, because we had such a larger population, we were able to split it into 3 groups. We had one which was the same day as the trigger. So again, mobile transfers can be done much more rapidly. And so that was a very quick trigger or quick transfer. Then we had another group that was comparing it about 1 month after the trigger happened. And then the third group was compared 2 months after. And in the terms of a traditional response, the quickest that we would expect would be more like a 2 month after an event response. And so in both of those, or in both of the countries, we're comparing cash versus nothing at first round, because again, people getting the AA are being compared to people who will get the transfer at a later point. We're then comparing the timing, so getting it later versus earlier, and then getting it, again, traditionally or much later versus earlier. Just to illustrate how this looks in practice, in Nepal, you can see that the dark line there is it's coming across as the water level. And as it peaks, you see that there was a trigger, and then the peak of the flood came, and then people got transferred as close as possible to that trigger. Then the first survey round came after that first transfer. Then there was a second trigger, and then again, the second survey round came after the second transfer, and then the third survey round came several months later. The reason for spacing out the third survey at that point was to understand how did this early transfer affect longer term outcomes around planting or livelihoods. In Bangladesh, again, we had a very similar design. The big difference here is you can see that there's 3 transfers and 3 surveys spaced out after those 3 transfers. And so what do we find? So in Nepal, we find that overall food security increased significantly for households that received the transfer early. The other thing to note is that the households that were most flood affected, so those who were actually affected by the shock, drove most of the results. So the more flood affected, the more benefit they had from the early transfer. But that was not that all the households were equally affected. And so there is this targeting trade-off that we saw in Nepal. The other thing is in Bangladesh, we see that improvements are, again, greatest for the earlier transfers. We also see that there's a significant impact on negative coping strategies, which shifts, again, from the earliest transfers beyondward. And later on, those impacts are much less. Because we had this similar design in both countries, we were able to pool the results. And you can see here on the bottom, you see the pooled estimates. And where in Nepal, if we saw things like we had an impact on life satisfaction, but it was not significant in Nepal only, it was a small impact. But when we combine that with Bangladesh, and you can see the IA transfer in round one for the life satisfaction, then the pooled impacts show that that is actually a significant result from getting a transfer earlier. And you can see that all the significant results for the pooled estimates are from receiving it in round one. So the earliest possible transfer had the biggest impact on the food consumption score, on the reduced coping strategy, and the life satisfaction. So in summary, we have now demonstrated, at least in 2 countries, that getting cash as early as possible has a big impact on the outcomes that we care about. We show that they get better food security, but also mental health and overall life satisfaction increases by getting earlier transfers. We also see this trade-off we talked about, where getting cash early does mean that people who are affected benefit more, but doesn't mean that everybody who gets it is affected equally. And so there is a potential trade-off between acting quickly and making sure that we actually treat the people or support the people who are most in need for this intervention. And so now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jesse, and we'll discuss briefly about how do impact evaluations contribute to learning in WFP and how are we using the evidence here? And then looking ahead, what evidence do we still need to make sure that our interventions are as cost effective as possible? So I'll stop sharing and then hand over to Jesse to answer some of those questions. Okay, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jonas, and thanks for the wonderful slides. I mean, I think, you know, as Jonas said, I started this anticipatory action program almost a decade ago with nothing, right? And not even the ability to go and knock on Jonas's door to ask for some evidence. But of course, you know, as everyone knows, that's the first question that you're always asked, right? Is does it work? Ultimately, does it work? And of course, as you've seen from Jonas, this requires a lot of thinking and a lot of putting things together. And you mentioned the context in which we're working at, and so our driving force is to make, you know, people's lives better, and never about these M&E pieces, right? So we need to balance all of these components together in the place that we work, which makes it exciting and challenging, and ultimately one of the most important jobs that we do. And so for me, sitting at HQ, I get to use these types of evaluations in 2 ways. So one being at the global coordinator, meaning that these types of evaluations do need to answer that question, does it work, to donors, in order for us to be able to articulate the need to start to bring this to other contexts, other hazards, other regions, you know, with differing pieces, but being able to showcase exactly how this is done. Of course, there's more to it than that, and that's the ability to make sure that these programs are operating at their utmost, you know, at the highest level of their ability to make these impacts. And it's these types of studies that allow us to make the kinds of tweaks in the different contexts, to make sure that these programs are running at the most efficient level. I mean, I think Jonas had said at the very beginning, you know, how difficult in the constrained environment it is, and everyone knows this. That we need to be able to squeeze out every last drop of performance along this process. And of course, in these times, making investments in evidence becomes quite challenging, because of people's wanting to put these financing towards the most vulnerable, but at the same time making sure that we continue to do things the best way. So for us, these evaluations have informed our operational protocols. When do we want to see cash being moved out? At what time ahead of a hazard? What types of other programmatic or contextual pieces do we need to maybe to adapt or even not pay attention to, and say, listen, you know, this is when the funding needs to arrive, and this is when we need to make sure that things are in place. And it's these types of studies that allow us to do that. And so for me, it's a two-way street, which makes things sometimes challenging, but of course the impact of such studies are incredibly important. And so the question was, you know, what evidence do we still need? And for me as a program manager, you know, sometimes that hits a bit of a soft spot, because I jokingly say, maybe I'll never arrive there. It seems as though I'm always asked this question, as though there's never an actual end. And I guess I can kind of understand that, as we, you know, Jonas said, these are the first 2, right? So this is our as WFP collectively putting down sort of the baseline in what we expect or what we would like to see in terms of rigorous and quality in terms of these types of evaluations. But they do take time. And in the context we're working in, there are a lot of other different types of impacts that can come in and crowd out or complicate some of these investments. And so from my perspective and Jonas's perspective as well, the questions that are coming our way are how long do we see some of these investments and impacts happening? It's one thing to say we'll look and see how people are doing before a hurricane and after a hurricane. But I think ultimately, and WFP has a number of climate programs that are implemented along these recovery timelines. Really, where do we see anticipatory action, the benefits rolling into our resilience type work, and sort of the longer term impacts of making these investments ahead of these extreme weather events. And this is allowing us then to define sort of the cost loss scenario. When are we wanting to act? What is the importance of acting like that? What are the risks of not acting? Do we see larger impacts in food security or mental health, et cetera, by not making some of these initial investments, or vice versa? And this is allowing us then at WFP with our government partners to make sure these programs and policies that we're putting in place are indeed informed by rigorous analysis, not just for finding more financing, but ensuring that these types of programs are then being implemented and integrated across these government ecosystems. Yeah, I think, Jones, did I cover?
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, I guess if there are questions from the audience, you can put them in the chat. So please type your questions there. I guess we can also just discuss this because we've got a few minutes to think about how this gets used. I guess from my perspective, I'm thinking about also at this point, what is the value? I mean, you mentioned that there's lots of questions, it'll never end, we need more evidence, but how do you use the evidence when you get it? What are the things that you would see are ways in which evidence gets used by WFP?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for us, and maybe not, it's not so clear to our external participants, but as WFP is now investing in its corporate strategy for the next 5 years, it's these types of studies that allow us to sit at the table and say, look, this needs to be a priority for WFP. And it's the same kind of conversations I get to have with our national governments. So when we sit down with the national disaster management agencies or national meteorological agencies and start to showcase or show how these investments in early warning systems, in prearranged plans, have these large impacts on saving lives, saving money, saving time, we start to create this a very positive space in which we can have communications on what is important. Because without these studies, we're stuck arguing around this is a good idea. And it is a good idea, but we lack sort of that ability to say why we want to prioritize it within this sort of funding constraints. And we really, at this point in time, some of the pieces that you showed around efficiency and effectiveness is exactly what our partners, whether they're governments or other UN agencies, are looking for in order to say, okay, let's keep moving ahead. Yes, there's some things to change. Yes, there's some things to improve. These types of evaluations are giving us that guideline on what types of improvements we can get in terms of those efficiencies and effectiveness. And that's how I need to be able to sit down with leaders and policymakers in determining, how is this a priority, and why don't national governments just give it all up and take an application from Google on their phone, right? And I think that would be a really sad place for us to arrive. And so these types of evaluations then allow us to work with our development partners in terms of we need to see investments in early warning systems here, here, and here. Why? Because we see impacts in people's, saving lives and saving livelihoods and saving money in these regions in which are being impacted incredibly well. And these are some of the improvements we can make.
Yeah.
And without that, I'm really stuck in what people would call pilot world, right? Constantly showing a pilot.
No, I mean, that's really great. I mean, so we got a question coming in. Is this evidence compared or triangulated with other analysis or findings consistent? So, I mean, in this context, so we've done these 2 RCTs, but I know that's not the only source of evidence that you have for anticipatory action. So what are the other sources of evidence that you've been drawing on, and how are you pulling this together to actually understand, like, again, how to make program decisions? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think some of the early evidence base, and this is where mine and your relationship started crossing, was people were comparing anticipatory action to nothing. Right, and it felt like an unfair and a bit of an unfair advantage in terms of we always knew there would be a response, but it would be late.
Hmm.
So we are able to start to triangulate that with some of these initial studies. In fact, WFP put out a paper and several years ago that is called The Evidence Base on Anticipatory Action, just laying it all out on terms of where are we standing. And that was sort of the baseline for mine and your conversation on saying, okay, this is good,
Hmm.
but not good enough.
Yeah.
So we're able to start to position this evaluation within that context. And then, of course, all of the different agencies are looking at different elements of anticipatory action programs. And we can see that this evaluation that we've done, is well in line with some of these other pieces. It's not an outlier
Sure.
at all. But that being said, this is one of the first most robust evaluations that we've been able to do because of that dedication in terms of time, funding, and basically understanding by senior leadership, both in national governments and WFP, that we did need to come back a month later, a couple months later, 3 months later, to collect this information, to really start to make sure that we were aligning and not only telling a story to donors, but making sure we were making that these programs were being implemented correctly. So I think we've managed to place the evaluations within this space of other types of evaluations, but we certainly don't think, and no, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have a massive database of other RCTs in which we can say, oh, I think we've basically put the first move out onto the board and said, let's collectively, right? This is why you've shared everything. Do the next round together and see, or how can people take this and start to make some changes to their work.
No, for sure. I mean, from my perspective, I think we always see RCT evidence as complementary to the other types. I would say that it's, like you said, it's very seldom that the direction of the findings contradicts completely with other findings. I think there's two reasons why RCTs are quite powerful. One is it's great to have lots of stories or anecdotal evidence around, oh yeah, of course, people were happy they got early, they could change the way they did things, or they could act differently because of that. But is that just because you interviewed the right person who was affected, or what does that mean at a population level? And I think RCTs are quite powerful because they give you that average treatment effect across a much wider population. And you can say it's not just a couple hundred or a few tens of people who think this is good for them. We look at a few thousand households, and a few thousand households are all benefiting from this. And so it really makes the story much more powerful. Okay, so there's another question here. If we had the floor for a minute or two at the COP negotiations on preparedness and resilience, based on what we found, what are your high-level recommendations? Yeah, I mean, I can take that and it'd be good to hear from you, Jesse. But from my side, like, if you think about the two contexts that we were just talking about, so in Nepal and Bangladesh, and these are countries which are repeatedly affected by climate-related shocks and stressors. I mean, Bangladesh is being flooded every year, and so it's not a surprise that they have a flood. Similarly, in Nepal, you've got earthquakes, you've got floods, you've got so many climate related disasters that are happening. And so I think what this is showing is that if you're in a context where that is becoming the new normal and you have severe shocks, then timing of your support, just making sure that the same dollar is actually reaching people at the right moment in that year, in that moment when they need it most, is having a significantly bigger impact. And so I would say, let's stop wasting money. Let's make sure that we stop pretending that these are surprise events. The world is going to have more climate shocks, and let's make sure the money gets where it has at the time where it has the most impact. I mean, I think that's what the clear message is coming out of this work. But Jesse, I don't know if you have some other things you want to tell the COP negotiators. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, look, we all know that these programs need to come together in a holistic sort of pathway, and so that's one of the great things about working for WFP, right? Because we spend so much time on all these different components. But I mean, I think it's clear these days that, as you just mentioned, we're consistently being impacted by these extreme weather events. We know they're coming. Our early warning systems across the globe are capacitated beyond sort of what they were, even just a few years ago. And there's really no reason for us to not see these storms on our doorstep. And there's really no reason for us to only prepare to respond when people are already destitute, and or losing all of our resilience gain. So I think seeing these things come together is exactly the space we need to be in order to make sure that those interventions on preparedness and resilience are also contributing to our investments on anticipatory action for sort of a much more exponential impact on how people can manage climate risk. Absolutely.
No, for sure. And I guess I think looking forward, and maybe from my side, it'd be good to hear your reflections, Jesse. But I, when we're talking about a household in Bangladesh or Nepal, we're really talking about someone who's, I mean, has their needs in terms of livelihoods and food security and wash and everything else. And in over the past whatever decades, these things have often been siloed in the UN. And so we have FAO providing seeds, we've got UNICEF working on wash, WFP working a bit on the cash side and trying to get the logistics in place. I think, I mean, from my perspective, as you know, I'm trying to promote a much more coherent, coordinated approach to how we generate evidence, that we're not just looking at it from a narrow angle. I guess it'd be good from here, like on your side, Jesse, what efforts are being made into making that more of a coordinated response and treating people like people with multiple needs in these situations. Yeah.
Well, it's evaluations like this, right? That allow us to be able to show exactly why we want to see these programs come together. I think the evaluation, took in as much as it could, and still, in terms of being able to provide us direction on where we want to see improvements in these programs in these countries. But absolutely, do they allow us to sit at the table and say how now, right? Which has become much more complicated for us, to make sure that they are also leveraging the preparedness investments of our partners in country and also our resilience components. But I think we've solved sort of that first step in that puzzle, which is providing this initial evaluations on AA. And now, I mean, everybody always wants to go for the most of everything, the biggest thing, all of the programs, all of the evidence, the whole shebang, as you know. But I think now we really needed to put this forward, these two evaluations, in order to set the tone on sort of how we want to see these programs being rolled out. And now we have an opportunity to start to have this discussion on, okay, we need to start to present this evidence across this continuum of preparedness, through our insurance programs, early action, all the way through response and into resilience. It makes absolute sense. And that's why it's such a logical space. So for me as this, program manager, without these two, evaluations as our first sort of toe in the water, saying, okay, here we are. We might be the new kid on the street, but we're bringing with us a significant amount of impacts, but also a significant opportunity to align with these other at scale programs that WP and partners invest in. So for us, I think being able to present that evidence next collectively across those programs will be a high priority, but definitely will be challenging for sure for us to make happen. Yeah.
No, for sure. So we only have a minute left. I don't know if there's any last minute questions for Jesse or myself. I guess, I mean, a couple things to know. You're mentioning the connection to the resilience, and my colleague Jennifer presented earlier today on our resilience work, and it is true. I mean, there we collected data every 2 months in very short 20-minute surveys for 2 years in 4 different countries. And in that context, you can see that this fluctuation in food security and changes in coping strategies, it does happen everywhere in the countries WFP operates. And as you mentioned, if you could provide the cash at the right time in relation to these shocks that are coming, you could help them protect their livelihoods, protect the assets they're creating. And so I think integrating our programming with our resilience programming and our AA program makes a lot of sense. I mean, we should not be doing these things in isolation, and for sure we should protect the investments that we have here at WFP in terms of how those things come together. And I just also note that there's also a lot of interactions between, again, people's ability to keep their livelihoods and their ability to keep people in schools. We see this interaction in South Sudan with our livelihood programming and the interaction with the UNICEF support to schools. And so there's a lot of things that are maybe unintended consequences of just getting these like program dimensions right. And I think there's a huge amount of work for us to do in bringing those pieces together. I think one last thing to note, and then I'll just and we'll close, is that you mentioned we only have 2 RCTs, and some people might know, like, not realize if that's a little or a lot. I mean, in comparison, for cash transfers in a normal development setting, there are over 120 RCTs. And even with 120 RCTs, there's still debates about how do you do it better? How do you make sure that it's more empowering for women? How do you work on digital financial inclusion? There's questions after 120 RCTs. So we're really early days in this on the anticipatory action side. And actually in the whole humanitarian space, there's very little RCT evidence, rigorous evidence to support our decisions. So I just put out a call there that it's not the only tool. I know there's a lot of evaluation people joining the session today, but it's a powerful tool that can help in complement to the other types of evaluation. But anyway, so thank you so much, Jesse, and thank you all for attending today, and it's great to continue this conversation again. Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Ciao, Jonas.